Spring and early summer is a very busy and exciting time in a vegetable garden. With the weather warming up and plants starting to grow, there can be a lot of hopeful enthusiasm about the season at this time of year. Paradoxically, there can be a seriously limited supply of vegetables to eat at the same time, or at least for those of us who want to or need to rely on what we can grow ourselves or depend on what is produced locally. We may have already eaten through much of the abundance that we were able to easily store from last season's growth, and anything that is left is likely sprouting or already decomposing. But with plants only just starting to grow in the gardens outside, there might not be much to harvest for several months. This period in between the abundance of two seasons is often referred to as the hunger gap, and it can be a rough time of year for local food supplies. How to fill this hunger gap depends a lot on the context and the climate, and here in Ireland it's definitely possible to do, and perhaps a lot easier than in other places, but it's not without its issues and compromises. The local climate largely dictates how long the main growing season is, and if anything can be grown for the rest of the year. Here in Ireland, our summers are usually quite cool, and we can get frosts as late as the end of May and as early as late September, which gives us a relatively short frost-free growing season, but we do have a fairly long season for growing frost-tolerant crops. We also have fairly mild winters, and because the soil rarely freezes and the site that I'm growing on is fairly free-draining and never floods, some crops can last right through the winter, though they tend not to grow very much until things warm up again in the spring. Like most places with a main growing season, most of the vegetables are harvested from the garden in late summer and the autumn. Some of these crops are easy to store, including carrots, beetroot, onions, and squash, but I've found that April is about the reasonable limit for the storability of these crops, as by then everything starts to sprout or has decayed or we've eaten our way through the supplies. This also tends to correspond to the availability of the last of the sprouting broccoli, kale, chard, and leeks that had overwintered in the gardens. So April tends to mark the time when supplies from the previous growing season are running out, and very little is available to harvest from the gardens outside. And it isn't until July when there is any real diversity that would be available. So this leaves 2 to 3 months with very little unprocessed or preserved vegetables available which were grown in the outside gardens. And for me, this represents the extent of the hunger gap in this climate. There are, of course, a lot of things that can be done to help fill this gap, to have local or self-grown vegetables available to eat throughout the year, including better storage conditions and growing different varieties of some vegetables. But preserving vegetables is perhaps the most effective way at filling the hunger gap, and I've frozen, dehydrated, canned, pickled, and fermented a wide range of vegetables when they're being harvested in abundance. It is great to have a pantry, freezer, and cellar full of preserves, but we tend to use them to supplement our diet, to provide a bit more variety or special treats at different times of the year. I would prefer to have fresh vegetables available throughout the season, and thankfully this is possible here in Ireland with the help of a protected microclimate, and this is where a polytunnel or glasshouse is invaluable. With the polytunnel, the plastic traps some of the warmth from the sun, and perhaps more importantly, keeps out a lot of the wind, producing a microclimate that is much better for growing in. This makes it possible to grow a lot of the heat-loving fruiting crops such as tomatoes and cucumbers in the summer, something that can be very difficult to grow outside in our climate. It also allows crops to grow over the winter, though perhaps very slowly, or at least to not be damaged by the winter winds, though this is not something that I have focused a lot on in the past few years. But it is the ability to extend the season, especially in the spring, that I think is the greatest benefit of a polytunnel. By increasing the temperature even a few degrees and reducing the damage from the winds, a wide range of crops can be grown and harvested a lot earlier than they can be in the open environment of the outside gardens. This is something that I have focused a lot on over the past few seasons, and have had significant success in growing a range of vegetables that are available to harvest during the hunger gap. In the past few years, so much of this garden has been planted with late spring and early summer crops that it's the most productive part of the season, and this fits well with the gaps in availability from the outside gardens. I've been able to grow a fairly wide range of hunger gap crops in this protected garden. The easiest and fastest are the diverse range of cool weather salad greens, including lettuce, mustard, spinach, rocket, and kale, which are often fast enough growing to be able to fit in with between other crops. I grow a few fast-growing root crops, including carrots, beetroot, turnip, radishes, as well as kohlrabi, but most of these take longer to produce a useful yield. I've had good success with some varieties of broccoli or calabrese, as well as cauliflower when they're sown early enough in the year. And potatoes can also produce a wonderfully early crop, but the tender plants do need extra protection from the hard frosts. I have found that onions grown from autumn planted sets can produce a large yield of fresh green onions, or even mature onions, a lot easier and earlier than they would be available from the outside gardens. And I've grown great early crops of peas and broad beans from a sowing in late autumn, as these plants seem to overwinter well in the polytunnel. Some of these crops are really fast growing and can produce a yield within a month or so, but if I want a wider range of vegetables, I need to rely on plants that can take a lot longer to mature, which generally need to be sown or planted from November to February. After everything is cleared from the polytunnel in the autumn, it is tempting to fill all the beds with lots of greens to harvest over the winter and into the spring, but this means that I can't use the same space for growing the wider range of hunger gap crops. Later in the spring, there is a lot of pressure to get the heat-loving summer crops into the ground, and in our climate, this would ideally be done at the time that roughly coincides with the start of the hunger gap. So I've found that there is a dilemma with growing in a polytunnel here in Ireland, as growing hunger gap crops means that I will be reducing overwintering and early spring production, and possibly delaying and reducing the main high-value summer crops such as tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers. There are, of course, different ways of getting around this, and the most obvious one is to have more or bigger polytunnels, and to divide this protected cropping space in two. And this is what I've been doing in the family-scale polytunnel garden that I manage. Half of this polytunnel is focused on the summer crops, and I try to get them into the ground early enough to get a good yield, and the other half of the polytunnel space is dedicated to hunger gap crops. Each year I swap the halves of the polytunnel, and with a bit of careful planning, I can get crops throughout the season. After the main summer crops are finished in the autumn, the beds are set aside to grow hunger gap crops, some of which are sown right away, or others in the early spring, which will be available to harvest from April through to July. These crops, when they're finished, are followed with vegetables that will be harvested in autumn and in winter, and others that will overwinter through to early spring, and which are then removed in time for the summer heat-loving crops again. The other half of the polytunnel is planted with the same 2-year cycle, only offset by 1 year, and this crop rotation has been quite successful for me during the past few years. I don't grow nearly as many summer crops as I would like, but we eat really well during the hunger gap. In the larger scale polytunnel of the Black Plot, I've been exploring the possibilities of intercropping this season, with different crops sharing the same bed. I sowed all 5 beds with 3 rows of a mix of different spring and hunger gap crops, and I tried to plant the middle row of each bed with the fastest maturing of the crops, including spring onions, radishes, rocket, and other spicy greens. These crops will be replaced by tomatoes, cucumbers, peppers, climbing beans, and courgettes or zucchini, which are planted in between the existing rows of spinach, carrots, lettuce, beetroot, and turnip, which will continue to produce over the next month or so. I plan to continue this intercropping into the summer with salad greens and herbs being planted under the partial shade of the taller plants. And it'll be interesting to see how things grow through the summer and how the interplanting can be transitioned into the winter and the overwintering crops. So far, it seems that this strategy is working reasonably well, though it is still early in the season, and I can definitely refine the timing and grouping of this intercropping. But this strategy isn't as simple as planting one crop in each bed, and there will be likely issues of competition, but it might be a more effective way at managing the conflict between hunger gap harvests and the main growth of the summer. In this context and climate, it is possible to harvest fresh vegetables throughout the year, especially if you have a polytunnel or other protected growing space. This is the approach that I've put the most effort into so far, but there are other options that I'm interested in, including growing a wider range of crops and carefully selecting the varieties of the vegetables that I do grow. Another approach would be to create better protection for the plants outside, essentially by covering the crops with temporary mini polytunnels, cloches, or cold frames to create microclimates similar to a polytunnel during the early part of the spring, in order to speed up the growth of the plants at the beginning of the season. I haven't explored this option too much, mainly because I have polytunnel spaces to grow in, but I have used fleeces and other coverings to protect tender plants from the frosts, and this could be extended to help speed up the growth of a wider range of crops. The biggest issue with this approach in my context is the strong winds that we can get, as anything that can keep the wind out can be blown away by the wind, and extra effort and care is needed to secure these coverings. I would also be interested to explore growing plants for longer in pots in smaller heated or protected spaces, perhaps with supplemental lighting, and to transplant much larger plants into the garden once the weather has warmed up enough. All of these options have issues, of course, and it is definitely easier to simply focus on summer and autumn crops, with perhaps some fast-growing greens in between, and to use various forms of preservation to stretch supplies of vegetables throughout the rest of the season. But all of these methods of preservation and storage have their own issues and often require equipment, as well as taking time and effort, usually at busy times of the season, and these factors need to be taken into account as well. In the end, the possibilities of getting year-round supply of vegetables really depends on the climate and the amount of effort and infrastructure the grower wants to devote to it. In this climate at least, it seems to come down to a choice between growing more of the summer heat-loving crops such as tomatoes and cucumbers, or being able to eat a wider variety of crops in late spring and early summer. And in my opinion, it's worth the trade-off.